On that, let's get more on those no-deal Brexit preparations, such as they are. Ministers are expected to meet today to discuss contingency plans for leaving the EU without a deal. The Brexit Secretary is reported to be planning a publicity blitz next week ahead of the crunch vote in Parliament. But we're joined from Westminster by George Eaton, Deputy Editor at The New Statesman, and by John Stevens, Deputy Political Editor at The Daily Mail. Gentlemen, a very good morning both. John Stevens, if we can start with you. In The Telegraph this morning, David Davis, former Brexit Secretary, is writing that time is our friend. What does he mean?
Well, David Davis thinks that the closer we get to the 29th of March when we're leaving the EU, he thinks that the EU will be under more pressure to give Theresa May a better deal. And he's saying if we run down the clock, if we get closer to the 29th of March and we show we are ready to leave without a deal, the EU will be more likely to give the Prime Minister more concessions. But over the Christmas break, Theresa May has been in contact with EU leaders. She said that she wants more legal assurances on the Northern Ireland backstop and how we could get out of that unilaterally or how it could be a temporary mechanism. And so far, we've not heard much progress. It's been all going on behind closed doors, and we'll see when Parliament comes back next week whether Theresa May has done enough, whether she has won any major concessions from EU leaders. But she's facing quite a tough situation, and some of her Brexiteers have been coming out in the last few days saying that they're still determined to vote against her Brexit deal when it comes back to Parliament the week after next. Sybil Cash, who's a leading Tory MP, has said that his New Year's resolution is to vote against the Brexit deal, which is possibly quite different from most people's New Year's resolution. So Theresa May has got an uphill battle, and she's going to need to convince a lot of MPs to be able to get her deal through Parliament.
George Eaton, is this Cabinet, is this Prime Minister ready for the type of brinkmanship that someone like David Davis seems to be advocating?
Well, I think Theresa May certainly thinks it is in her interests to hold the vote as close as possible to the 29th of March. I think primarily because Number 10's calculation has always been that MPs will back a deal, whatever deal is on the table, and that's only the deal that Theresa May signed at present, for fear of crashing out with no deal. Now, although the government has stepped up preparations for that outcome, the idea that Britain is prepared for no deal, the idea that there can be some kind of managed no deal is unfortunately a fantasy, and the UK would take a far bigger economic hit from no deal than the EU. And so I think for that reason, the EU has never regarded it as a particularly credible threat. I think it's not in Theresa May's nature to engage in such dramatic acts. So my belief is that if the UK approaches no deal, then it will plead for an extension to Article 50, even if MPs have yet to agree on an alternative, such as a second referendum or an early general election.
John Stevens, she's still got a little bit of time to work with Theresa May. I just wonder whether this idea that perhaps there'll be a few drinks parties at Number 10, she'll offer a few blandishments to the backwoodsmen, I think we used to call them, didn't we? Can that really make a difference? Can she actually apply pressure on individual MPs, a bit of charm, and get them to change their minds?
Well, I think the thing that Theresa May needs to get her Tory MPs who are threatening to rebel back on side is slightly more than a drinks party in Number 10. I think for most of them, what they want to see is legally binding guarantees around that backstop, and they want her to come back from Brussels with something slightly more firm than that she's got in the deal at the moment. But as well as wooing Tory MPs, also Theresa May is trying to woo the DUP, her allies that keep her in power. At the moment, they've said that they will vote against the withdrawal agreement. For the last few days, we've seen yesterday Nigel Dodds, Deputy Leader of the DUP, in Number 10. And Downing Street are hoping if they get the DUP back on side, that will have a domino effect, and then other Tory MPs will follow and also agree to back the deal.
George Eaton, the strategy from Number 10 also seems to be to get the Prime Minister back on the plane, meetings perhaps with Mark Rutte, Angela Merkel, Tusk again. What prospect do you think for success there?
Fairly limited, I'd say. I mean, there has been this belief throughout the Brexit process, and even before that with David Cameron's renegotiation, that a European politician will come to Britain's rescue and produce the concessions that it needs to get a good deal from Europe. I think it's very unlikely that the EU will offer anything new on the withdrawal agreement, and therefore it will be very hard for Theresa May to get the DUP back on side, which Number 10 certainly see as a preliminary to getting more Tory rebels back on side. The EU has seen Euroscepticism growing across the continent. And for those reasons, I think it's always believed it can't be seen to be too generous to Britain because it risks heightening the incentive for other member states to follow a similar path and to similarly try and extract a better deal from the EU.
John Stevens, we've mentioned the DUP. Is there anything, really, that the Prime Minister could offer the DUP that would sway them at this late stage?
I think so. I think with the DUP, it is quite clear what they want. They want, and their opposition to the withdrawal agreement is around very specific areas on the Northern Ireland backstop. And I think if Theresa May was able to get more legally binding guarantees on that, if maybe she was able to negotiate some sort of side treaty which made clear that was a temporary arrangement, I think she could bring the DUP back on side. I think more of a problem for her is some of her Brexiteer opponents, who I think if she did manage to win back some guarantees on the backstop, I think they would still find stuff they were unhappy with in the agreement. I think the DUP is more realistic that she can bring some of those back inside. But for some of her more hardline opponents, I think there's very little she can do to actually make them vote for a deal.
And George, any sense that perhaps over the Christmas holidays, when it comes to Jeremy Corbyn's position in all this, that perhaps he's gone away, looked at some of the polling numbers, looked at some of the tweets by people like Andrew Adonis and others who are increasingly exasperated with his position and thought, you know what, maybe it's worth a change of thinking?
No, there's no sign of that, to be honest, despite the increasing anger and outrage from some Labour supporters of Remain. Jeremy Corbyn's view is that the result of the 2016 referendum should be respected. And his team also fear that backing a second referendum would damage Labour's chances of election. Most Labour constituencies voted Leave, even though most of the party's voters were for Remain. So there are a significant number of Labour MPs who fear losing their seat. And Labour also fear alienating some of the marginal voters in seats they need to win to ever form a government. So based on that political calculation, they don't think it's in their interests to support a second referendum. But of course, they haven't ruled out that option. I think it's still possible that in extreme circumstances, they may move towards that. But they certainly don't see it as a priority. And Jeremy Corbyn is also, of course, a lifelong Eurosceptic. He spoke over the Christmas period of some of his concerns around EU rules on state aid. So for a mixture of policy and political reasons, there's no sign of him moving towards a second referendum at the moment.
George Eaton from the New Statesman, John Stevens of the Daily Mail, thanks both very much.